I'm sorry that you feel this way about us, but we love our children with everything we have. We've never went without, thanks to Summer's daddy and my husband. He's always provided for us and has worked as much as he could and can and still is. And I'm sorry that you guys feel that way, but that's my baby, and nobody would ever treat her like that as long as I was around. Ever.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In this episode, we're going to look at some very touchy and sort of troubling issues, and it's going to be a very unusual episode in the sense that it's both very deep and some people might think very superficial at the same time. I think it's quite a cerebral subject. We're looking in a weird way from a distance at issues of poverty and also some sort of medical syndromes. I don't often talk about things like disorders because I feel like it oversimplifies things, but I do think that this one is to some extent possibly valid, probably relevant, and by the end of this episode it would be good to hear what you guys think. Is it relevant? Isn't it? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to everyone who participated in yesterday's live, and let's get started. In the early days of the Summer Wells case, when we were interrogating the issue of neglect, someone mentioned that a certain level of neglect may be benign and might even be part of an idyllic childhood in the outdoors. In this episode, I want to talk about things like fetal alcohol syndrome and intergenerational poverty. But before we get to that, we need to pull out of the forest, withdraw out of the woods and rise above them. We want to sort of float above the woodlands of Tennessee at a sort of altitude where we can get a proper perspective on these tricky, touchy, and maybe even controversial subjects. So we're going to start by examining these subjects in a totally different area. We're not even going to look at the Wells family, but we are going to come back to them. I do want to start off by saying, when we saw Summer playing in the rain, we tried to imagine innocence flourishing in decrepitude. When we saw her splashing at the swimming hole, we hoped for the same thing. There was a sort of naive nostalgia in that, the idea of poverty as a virtue. Now, I do think there is virtue in poverty, in not excess, not having too much money or too much stuff or whatever it is. There's virtue in living kind of a Spartan life and keeping things simple to some extent. There's also virtue in suffering. We learn through suffering. You can take any Olympian and when they get the gold medal, they will give credit to the struggle during all the training. And I think the whole thing where people go to Mount Everest, to climb Mount Everest, wealthy people, millionaires, living in tents and struggling and suffering. I think what is unconsciously being strived for there is virtue through suffering and through a kind of poverty. But I think there's a world of difference between saying that and saying poverty is virtuous. Suffering kind of for its own sake is virtuous. There's virtue in it, but the thing itself, I don't know if it's that virtuous. I think you want to go through it in order to transcend it. So if we think about Summer playing in the rain, splashing at the swimming hole, was that a sign of virtue? Or are we seeing an idyllic childhood? Are we seeing almost an example of how the American dream should be, kind of thing? What do you guys think? Now, for those of you who have read my book, The Murder of Vincent van Gogh, you'll be familiar with the famous Dutch artist's thought patterns regarding poverty. He got very caught up in it. Van Gogh became obsessed with the writings of Emile Zola and Charles Dickens. both authors who saw poverty as a virtue. Van Gogh himself was from a fairly privileged family and stood to inherit a small fortune from his father. Instead, he became a prodigal son, boozing, whoring, and both of these at the same time, and it became the backdrop to his life as a painter. He painted a very famous painting called Van Gogh's Chair, which shows this very simple straw and wood chair. And he kind of contrasted that with another artist's chair, which is very much more luxurious. But it was, in a way, a self-portrait to say, I'm a simple man with simple tastes, right? Now, a modern narrative, and these narratives of idealism are invariably tragic. We know Van Gogh's story doesn't end happily ever after. Well, another one is John Krakauer's Into the Wild, based on the real-life story of Christopher McCandless. Christopher McCandless literally burned his money, left his vehicle in a dry riverbed, and then forged a new identity as Alexander Supertramp. He was searching for a sense of being alive. He absolutely rejected the society of today. He overtly rejected it. Now, if poverty is a virtue, it means the world of commerce and capitalism, big money and big tech, is corrupt. That's often how the thinking goes. It's a tempting way of seeing the world. And in the 90s, I know when I was a full-time triathlete, I was also naively scornful of money and poor and struggling. I was a struggling triathlete. I was happy in a way, but yes, as a result of my attitude, I was also a little bit struggling financially. But I mean, isn't the way to live and live fully to be free, to be unshackled by wages and utility bills? And so in this respect, I'm going to provide you with a link to what's the true story of Chris McCandless. So in Into the Wild, you get one version of it, but there's another version. The toxic parenting that was going on, the alcohol abuse of his parents, the strictures that they put him on, that in a way he was a slave to institutionalization, and he wanted to be free of that. Now, I mean to return to Summer Wells, but let's address the Dickensian approach to poverty and just poke the concept a little to see whether it's aged well or not, right? And this is a quote from History's Now magazine. Dickens acknowledged that poverty was not the fault of the people who endured it, but rather the fault of the establishment, including the government. Indeed, I dare say that he would be of the same view today, that poverty is the fault of the government. And that's the end of the quote. Do you guys agree? Do you think poverty is the government's fault? Do you think with Candace and Don and some of the other people in the story, it's their own fault, or it's all the fault of the government, or a bit of both? Is it more of the one or more of the other? What do you guys think? I've got to say, I'm not sure I agree with it. I'm not sure that with poor people you can always say it's somebody else's fault. Are we as a society innocent victims of ruthless bureaucracy and heartless capitalism? It sometimes feels like that, doesn't it? Think of some of the characters in true crime in terms of that statement. Innocent victims of ruthless bureaucracy and heartless capitalism. And then think of Chris and Shanann Watts and the multi-level marketing and Adako. Think about the Ramseys and his big business, Access Graphics and Lockheed Martin, and beauty pageants, right? And then think about Amanda Knox. Murder made her famous from the position that she was in at the time. The same with the West Memphis Three. Look at O.J. Simpson. Look at Jodi Arias and Casey Anthony. Some of these people got their start in life thanks to true crime. Murder's actually been good for them in a pretty disheartening way, I think, a pretty disconcerting way. Now, so let me ask you again, do you think it's true that poverty isn't anyone's fault? or that the poor are poor because the poor are poor because it's someone else's fault. Well, they like to believe that, but do you? They believe salvation comes from the outside, from God, the government, from charity and handouts. Do you? Well, let's look at Summer Wells and see how that question sits with reality, shall we? I'm going to take the position here that Candace and Don and Grandma are the architects of their fate rather than innocent victims. And I think what's just happened now, you sort of have everything happening with Summer Wells. She disappears. Don saying, you know what, I'm gonna live properly from here on out. I'm gonna stop drinking, and then he drank again. And how many times has he made that sort of declaration? You know what, I'm not going to touch a drop of alcohol again. And then what happens? Over and over again. And I think one can make that claim that they are actually the architects of their own fates rather than innocent victims. I'm not saying they're not innocent at all, or that they are that they've been caught up in a gyre that's not entirely of their making, but I think some of that is of their making. And how I make that argument is I basically say, let's look at this notion of fetal alcohol syndrome and intergenerational poverty, not as isolated concepts, but these concepts working together. The fetal alcohol syndrome and intergenerational poverty holding hands with one another in a ruinous cycle, filtering down from one life and one lifestyle into another, taking over whole families and then infecting subsequent generations and then generations after that. So I put it to you, and that's kind of a legal statement where someone will say, I'm going to make this statement and what do you think of it? So I put it to you that in the Wells fable, we're dealing with at least 3 generations of dysfunction. It's passed down from father to son, and we've seen that dysfunction and substance abuse from Don's father to Don, and to some extent from Don to Donald Wells Jr., right? And when that son becomes a father to his son, also from mothers to their children, and from grandmothers to grandchildren. All the individuals at the center of the story drink and smoke excessively. Even when you look at the table where Chris McDonough is speaking to Alison, well, everyone sitting at that table smokes. The great-grandmother, Alison herself, and her 15-year-old son. It's not that surprising that, is it any wonder that a 15-year-old is chomping at the bit to also drink and smoke? And I was certainly raised where you don't do that. Not so much in the family structure, but in the wider structure. My sister, I think, was already smoking at 14 years old. And much later in her life, her and my father would sort of trade cigarettes. Both of them have quit smoking now. But I'm just saying, you do have often a link intergenerationally, right? And it is what people do. When they've got nothing to do, if they're unemployed and they're mooching about, what else is there to do except drink and smoke? And perhaps they think that's what life's all about. Maybe they think that's what they were born to do. If a young son is seeing his father who's sort of laying about, but what he really enjoys taking a drag from his cigarette. He really licks his lips when he's just finished a whiskey or something, right? But in terms of fetal alcohol syndrome, it works in 2 ways. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASDs, and this comes from the CDC website, are a group of conditions that can occur in a person whose mother drank alcohol during pregnancy. These effects can include physical problems and problems with behavior and learning. Often a person with a FASD is a mix of these problems. So you're not only going to have a physical manifestation where you're going to see this on someone's face, but there's going to be problems with how they behave and also to some extent their mobility, their ability to be coordinated, their ability to learn, their ability to remember. A lot of the symptoms from fecal alcohol syndrome are similar to if you're drunk. You can't remember, you're disorientated, you struggle to focus. It's just much, much longer term. It's sort of like a long-term disability. So let me ask you, do you think Candace abstained from alcohol when she was pregnant? Do you think Grandma did? What about Alison? And this brings us to the title of this video, Why Does Candace Look So Weird? And someone actually provided me with this information in a tweet, and there are apparently some very idiosyncratic, very characteristic signature facial features of fetal alcohol syndrome. They include a low nasal bridge, so kind of a flattish nose and a wideish nose. The nose is sort of upturned. It's almost like a piggish nose. A thin vermilion border to the upper lip. So the upper lip is quite small relative to the lower lip. The chin is underdeveloped. It might be sort of recessed to some extent. But the other things is as well, like a very wide gap between the nose and the top of the upper lip. So a very wide upper lip area, a very flat cheek sort of area that's sort of I don't quite know how to say that. And then the other features as well, I'm not going to go into here. But some of the other traits include poor memory, difficulty with attention, hyperactivity, and we know that's something that has been associated with Macbeth, ADHD, even just a sheer intellectual disability, low IQ, speech and language delays. We've already noticed something like that when Candace spoke during the Sermon on the Mount, the slurring. What does she speak like when she's not under the influence? But then there's also other things, vision and hearing problems, and poor reasoning and judgment skills, poor impulse control, and so on and so on. In short, fetal alcohol syndrome can hobble a person for life. Right? So in that sense, if your grandma or your mother drank while she was pregnant, then you end up inheriting this self-limiting scenario, which you sort of, in a weird way, doomed to express or explore, right? And so what happens is the people that have been exposed to this have been dumbed down in a way in the womb by the mother who's unable to control her thirst for alcohol. The child not only inherits this thirst, but is cast into a setup destined to repeat itself, right? They can't concentrate, they can't focus, they can't remember things, they can't reason very well, they can't get a proper education, so they can't get a job. And at the end of that road is a shining light, like a light at the end of the tunnel. Except that light's not God, it's a bottle of alcohol. It's another drink. It pretends to be light and relief. Instead, it's darkness, suffering, and death. According to the National Center for Children in Poverty, quote, individuals who were poor during childhood are more likely to be poor as adults than are those who were never poor, end quote. I would sort of say as well that children who were poor in childhood and also whose parents use substances and influence them to use substances are also likely to use substances as adults and to be poor as adults. I think both of those go hand in hand, the poverty and the substances and the poverty. I've also heard a statement, your anger is what keeps you poor. And so if you're unable to tame the dragon, that thing that is eating at you, then you're going to need something to soothe it. And that is what these substances are for. And that is what keeps them poor. In this story of a little life gone missing, we have the dysfunction and the decrepitude on the one side and the church on the other. We have the woods and the appearance of hardscrabble living and the church talking about faith and love. We have darkness and light, and this impression that poverty may be a virtue after all. Evil isn't here, not within these walls, or within these woods, or within these hearts and minds. It's out there. Some stranger that we haven't seen yet, some outsider that we don't know about, some intruder, some abductor, some stranger is the reason for this disaster, not the people at the center of it. So don't judge a book by its cover. So I'm not going to take it further than that. If you guys want me to explore the mythos of poverty in more detail, there's certainly a lot more to say on the topic. Then you should let me know in the comments, and I can take that theme certainly a little bit further forward. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.